one. We have liftoff.
Yesterday, the two biggest rivals in spaceflight, at least arguably, went head-to-head with tests of their biggest rockets. And even though it appeared on the surface that both companies had mixed results on their test flights, with both companies losing essentially half of the rocket in the process, with New Glenn losing its booster as they attempted to land it, and SpaceX losing the orbiter, and the FAA required mishap investigations from both companies as well, there was a clear winner and a clear loser yesterday in terms of the advancement of their respective rockets. Blue Origin may not have had a perfect flight, but they did have a complete success as far as their primary goals of this test flight. SpaceX, on the other hand, did not succeed at the most important parts of their test flight, which is everything they intended to do with the orbiter after the launch. Now, nobody can take anything away from SpaceX's amazing accomplishment having captured the booster for a second time. This was an amazing accomplishment, but in virtually every other respect, test flight number 7 of Starship was a failure. And not only was it a failure as far as the advancement of Starship as a transport system to space, it also was a failure that arguably put civilian lives at risk. This could have a significant impact on the development of this rocket in the short term, for the next few months anyway. And given the fact that I've just made most SpaceX fans mad enough to chew stainless steel, I'm going to show all of you why Blue Origin had a much better day yesterday than SpaceX did. So first of all, let's have a look at the primary test objectives of both companies for both rockets. The main thing that Blue Origin wanted to accomplish yesterday was getting New Glenn to orbit. Now, in addition to that, of course, they wanted to make sure that New Glenn actually reached the mid-Earth orbit trajectory that it was supposed to reach, and also deployed and activated the Blue Ring test particle. It was not a full-fledged Blue Ring spacecraft, but a Pathfinder vehicle that could be communicated with and deployed, but didn't have the same capabilities as a full-fledged Blue Ring. Most probably because Blue Origin was not 100% confident that New Glenn was going to be able to carry out this launch successfully, and so they didn't want to lose an entire Blue Ring spacecraft in the process. But had they actually put one on this rocket, it would have made it to its desired orbit, it would have been deployed, it would have been communicated with, because the information we've gotten from Blue Origin thus far suggests that all of those test objectives were satisfied. The only thing that Blue Origin failed to do was land their booster. Don't know how close they came to the Jacqueline. We don't have a great deal of information yet as to exactly how the booster did during its attempt to land, or whether it completely broke up in flight, or if they had to activate the flight termination charges. All we do know is that the engines did fire, and Blue Origin claims that they came very, very close, but they couldn't have come that close, because if the booster had hit the Jacqueline trying to land, or plunged into the ocean very close to the Jacqueline, then the FAA would not have required a mishap investigation, because I'm certain that a potential loss of the booster was built into Blue Origin's flight plan yesterday, and had New Glenn adhered to that flight plan very closely, then the FAA would have had no justification to demand a mishap investigation, and that's not what happened. That suggests to me that the booster had to be destroyed with flight termination charges or plunged into the ocean a significant distance from the Jacqueline barge. So not a very good day for the New Glenn booster, but once again, that's something that Blue Origin expected to have happen with the first flight of this rocket. Keep in mind, of course, that we didn't have anything close to this good of a performance from Starship on its first flight, but then again, we are not comparing apples to apples with these two companies' philosophies if we're talking about test flights, because at this point, New Glenn is a fully mature rocket with all of its components having been tested to failure. Had New Glenn failed to reach its appropriate orbit, had it failed to accomplish a lot of its primary objectives in this flight, that would have been an abject failure for Blue Origin, because this rocket should be mature enough to perform extremely well on its first launch, much in the same way as SLS did on its first flight and Vulcan Centaur did on its first flight, whereas SpaceX, when they fly Starship, a lot of the components haven't been thoroughly tested at all, and this was especially the case with Flight 7 because it was the first flight of the Block 2 Starship orbiter, which had many modifications, lots of changes, increased propellant load, increased weight, a big fundamental change with this orbiter, and if anything was going to go wrong with Starship yesterday, it was almost certainly going to be something involving the Block 2. All that having been said, though, Blue Origin had another key success with their flight yesterday, and that was the performance of their engines. The BE-4 has now performed perfectly on 3 consecutive flights, with 11 engines having fired and performed exactly as intended, and even the BE-3Us, having been employed for the first time on a flight, performed perfectly as well, delivering the second stage into exactly the right orbit, an orbit that, as I've talked about a number of times previously, was actually pretty ambitious for a first flight test orbit, something that had an apogee of 19,300 kilometers and a perigee of 2,400 kilometers. Indeed, New Glenn achieved a higher altitude yesterday than Starship has with all of its flights combined. So New Glenn made a very impressive statement yesterday, albeit not a perfect one. Had it been a perfect flight, obviously they would have landed the booster or at least gotten the booster close enough to the Jacqueline to not trigger an investigation from the FAA. So I think that Blue Origin does have a pretty long road ahead of them when it comes to reusing the booster, and that's significant when it comes to the overall business case for this rocket. At the moment, it's just an operational heavy lift rocket with a very big fairing. As a matter of fact, New Glenn has the second biggest fairing of any operational commercial rocket now. The only operational rocket that has a bigger fairing is SLS, and NASA isn't going to be using SLS for anything except Artemis, and neither is anybody else. So this was a very big accomplishment overall for Blue Origin yesterday. The accomplishment that SpaceX made, and this is something that should not be minimized, was the second successful capture of the Super Heavy booster. That is a very big deal, because if you want to get 100% reusability out of this massive rocket, which is the only thing that justifies its existence really, you don't need another colossal expendable rocket. We already have one of those, that's SLS. Well, a big step forward was taken yesterday when it comes to that objective, because the capture of the Super Heavy booster a couple of flights ago was not a fluke. It was not just a lucky break. It's a huge step on the road to reusability. That being said, however, yesterday was a near catastrophe for SpaceX on nearly every other level. It's not just the fact that a fire broke out in the engine section of the rocket. And hopefully that had nothing to do with the engines, but rather something to do with the new propellant tanks or some of the new fuel feed systems that had to be installed on this rocket in order to make it work. It's significantly bigger than the previous version of the orbiter, with much larger fuel tanks, different control systems, different avionics, so many new modifications. I can't imagine that it was a Raptor 2 malfunction that led to the problem. But nevertheless, SpaceX lost control of the orbiter pretty early in the flight, and it re-entered the atmosphere over the Caribbean. And it was a spectacular re-entry, to say the least. And it was a lot more than just spectacular. It also created a near chaotic situation with air traffic in the region, with flights being diverted under emergency circumstances away from the falling debris. Again, unexpectedly. I don't think anybody thought that this was going to happen with a Starship orbiter after so many successful orbital tests. But again, this is something that should have been anticipated, because in so many respects, this Block 2 orbiter was a brand new rocket. And when you have a brand new rocket, you have brand new problems. Now have a look at this. We had a loss of one sea level Raptor at the beginning of the malfunction, then a vacuum Raptor and another sea level Raptor, followed by another vac Raptor and another sea level Raptor before telemetry was lost with the vehicle entirely. That suggests to me that we had a slowly, or rather rapidly, spreading fire in the engine compartment, not a sudden loss of the vehicle, not a sudden activation of the flight termination charges, but rather a gradual process that took out one engine after another very rapidly, and only at that point were the flight termination charges activated. And in spite of what SpaceX had to say officially about this anomaly, quote, Starship flew within its designated launch corridor, as all U.S. launches do, to safeguard the public both on the ground, on water, and in the air. Obviously, the situation in the air was not as safe as was suggested. Obviously, there had to be something going on to cause these last-second diversions of flights across the entire re-entry corridor. Again, this may have been a mistake. This may have been short-sighted decision-making on the part of the FAA to allow aircraft to travel so close, and indeed even transitioning across this flight corridor during this launch. This may have been a pretty irresponsible decision overall. We're going to have to see exactly what the story was with these emergency diversions that took place at the last moment. But nevertheless, I suspect that most of these things happened as a result of an abundance of caution rather than a clear and present threat to the aircraft in question. Now, of course, I can hear a lot of you saying, this was a test flight. All of these are test flights. We can't expect complete success this early in the process. You hate SpaceX. You hate Elon, blah, blah, blah. But let's go ahead and compare Starship's test schedule and the results of these test flights to Falcon 9's test schedule that took place in 2010. On the 4th of June 2010, SpaceX's Falcon 9 did a Dragon spacecraft qualification flight, and it was successful. The only thing that failed about that flight was the attempt to try to parachute the first stage into the ocean, and it burned up on re-entry before the parachutes could be deployed. Then the second flight of Falcon 9 was just as successful, and this was the demo flight of the Dragon cargo ship up to the International Space Station. Again, a very, very successful flight with 3 hours of thruster maneuvering and then a re-entry of the spacecraft, again without any significant problems. And then this 22nd of May 2012, so 2 years later, Falcon 9 flew again, another successful flight with no attempt to land the booster. October 8th, 2012, the fourth flight of Falcon 9. Again, a very successful flight, but not entirely successful because one of the payloads, an Orbcom satellite, was lost. So some failures in the early process, but Falcon 9 was already carrying commercial cargoes by this time. March 1st, 2013, another successful flight. And then the 29th of September, 2013, yet another customer. In this case, the first commercial mission with a private customer with a launch from Vandenberg. Now, to be fair, this was the first ocean touchdown test that was ever carried out with Falcon 9, and the booster started rolling as it neared the ocean, leading to the shutdown of the central engine as the roll depleted it with fuel, resulting in a hard impact with the ocean. So at this stage, on the sixth test flight of Falcon 9, definitely the booster wasn't landing nearly as successfully as Starship's booster is landing at the moment, but nevertheless, we were not having situations where orbiters were being completely lost, even in this early stage of Falcon 9's development. So although it can definitely be argued that as far as booster recovery and reusability is concerned, Starship is advancing quicker than Falcon 9 did, as far as being a consistently successful commercial rocket is concerned, Falcon 9 was doing much better by this time. Flight 7 of Falcon 9 was the first geostationary transfer orbit launch for Falcon 9 and the first successful reignition of the second stage. This particular flight put the Falcon 9 rocket into a super synchronous transfer orbit of 79,341 kilometers in apogee with an inclination of 20.55 degrees to the equator. A very, very ambitious flight, far more ambitious than anything that Starship has carried out to this point. And it's also worth noting that even after this extremely successful flight, Falcon 9 only flew 6 times in the following year of 2014. Atlas V actually flew more times than SpaceX did that year. So with that kind of track record, we cannot expect Starship to be flying 25 times in 2025, as many observers have suggested recently. And although I am completely convinced that Starship will eventually be a 100% successful system and will transform the future of spaceflight, that may not happen as quickly as we need it to happen as far as Artemis is concerned. Because keep in mind, Artemis is going to require at least a dozen launches of Starship just to reach the moon. 10 refueling flights, 1 flight in order to deploy a fuel depot, and 1 flight of lunar Starship itself. And that is at minimum, by the way. There are other observers who estimate that it could take as many as 15 refueling flights to make lunar Starship work and to get it all the way to the moon and back, or back to a rendezvous with Orion. So all of that being said, I think it would be a very, very bad idea indeed to look at canceling SLS, canceling Orion, and canceling everything that's been built into Artemis that works at this point in favor of a system that is extremely promising, a system that will definitely revolutionize spaceflight, but also a system that is not going to be ready to replace SLS for quite some time. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. I definitely can't keep this channel going without your help, and I really appreciate all of your support. I've got a new video coming out in just a few days about the Salyut 6 space station and its amazing accomplishments that have been seldom talked about in the media, the first truly international space station. So stay tuned for that, and until next time, stay angry about space.
What are those?
Look up, everybody, look up!
Look up!